In this video, I'm going to talk about one of the most important features of RackForms, which is its ability to communicate with databases and update existing data in your database. So we have a couple different automated ways of doing this, but in this video specifically, we wanted to talk about the sort of low-level aspects of what's happening so that when you use one of the automated systems, you can appreciate sort of what's going on behind the scenes so that if you ever need to make changes or small tweaks, you'll be able to do so. And the reason why this is actually possible is because behind the scenes, RackForms is just writing SQL for you and then putting that SQL into SQL items that are executed when the page loads. So for example, if I have a very simple form here with 2 fields and a submit button, I can go ahead and call this field name, I'll call this one age, and I can submit this then to a submission page. So submission page then will take an SQL plus item. The SQL plus item will run an insert statement for us. And this, as you may recognize, is just literal raw SQL. So I could actually take this statement, I could paste it into my SQL editor here, and I can say, by way of changing the 2 fields that we're going to write, I can say name and age, go ahead and insert for the values, let's say Matt and 43. And when I run this statement right here, this is going to execute the statement, provided I get the table name right. And we can actually see the result of this insert right here. So there's Matt and 43. If I go back, I can change it to Matt new and 44, run the statement, and sure enough, there's Matt new 44. So this statement, I can quite literally copy and paste this into RackForms, call this Matt new 2, make it 45, and when I run this form, without filling anything in my fields, I just submit this, and it's going to insert this into my database. So I have these 3 new records. So we're just running raw SQL right here. Now, of course, running SQL that has predefined variables is very rarely useful for us as form developers. So what we actually do is we'll, instead of raw values, we'll put in placeholders, which in RackForms are question marks. So I'll put in a question mark here, and I'll put in a question mark here. So now what we're saying is insert an FTP demo name and age, the values are question mark, question mark. Now if I try to run this as SQL, this will not work because it doesn't know what a question mark is. It's expecting a string, for example, and then a integer, and it's getting effectively neither of those two. Even though question mark is a string, it's not actually a quoted string like this, so it's being confused. So although this doesn't mean anything to a SQL editor like you have right here, it does mean something to RackForms, because what it means is that when it sees a question mark, it actually wants a variable added right here. So I could then put in a variable, so in this case a string of Matt and an age of 56. And when I run this query again, it's once again, I actually need to make this a double quoted string. It's once again going to be valid code in that it's going to run to my submission page and it's going to actually insert into my database. But you can see here that it has some issues getting the values out of this. And so generally speaking, and once again, we're not hard coding values. What we're actually doing is using what we call tokens. So in RackForms, if I want to grab the name and age form field, I'm going to use the form field token called name. So I use a capital F in name because that's the name of this form field. If I want to grab age, I'll say form field age. And now when I run this form, now it's actually going to take the values that I put in here, and it's going to dynamically insert them into my form. So we'll see Matt new 4 and 99. So hopefully you can kind of see then this interplay between there's raw SQL and then there's a slightly modified version of SQL that allows us to take dynamic variables from the form fields that we're filling out. Now what's critical about this is that this can also be used to get variables out. So if I delete this item entirely, I'll go back to my form page and I will add a query item to my page under data advanced right here. So, or excuse me, data and email. And what this guy is going to do is it's actually going to select the ID, name, and age fields from FB demo where 1 equals 1. Now, if you've never used SQL before, 1 equals 1 is just kind of like a catch-all. So if I run this, it's just going to return all those records, which would be the effect of just saying there's no where statement. However, where statements are really important because I can say, for example, where name equals Matt. And now when I run this, it's only going to return the records that have name equals Matt. So we can do the exact same thing in RackForms. I can copy this statement and I can just paste this in here. I can turn on my debug mode to data dump, so it just kind of prints out what it's getting. And same as this sort of prints out a record right here, this is going to do the same thing. It's going to just print out those two records. So here it's in a nice table format. Here, of course, it's in sort of a programmatic format where it's an array, but the end result is the same. It's 302 in Matt and age 43, 378 Matt and age 43 again. So knowing that we can effectively run raw SQL and we can put variables into our SQL when we're doing inserts, it hopefully won't come as a surprise that we can do the same thing. That is, we can pull variables out from select statements as well. So in this particular case, I could say where name equals question mark, and for the variable, I could just put in G name. So what is G name? Well, G is a get variable, and the get variable that I'm going to pull from is called name. So what I can do now is, you'll notice now that this Q1, this little query that's running, it's not returning a result. If I were to say name equals Matt, well, now it's going to return those records for me again. So these are get variables, get strings you often call them, and the variable I'm passing in is Matt. So same as we said where name equals Matt here, that's effectively what we're doing here. Where name equals some value, the some value is coming from the get string called name. So G name equals Matt. So now that we know that we can sort of pull variables out dynamically, well, now we do an interesting thing, which is I can pre-populate fields. So I'm running a query at the top of my page. I can go to my name field, and under default/hidden value, I can just type in Matt. And if I run my form, you'll notice that Matt is the value here. But I want this to be dynamic. So it turns out that this little button right here, if I press this, it will see that we're running a dynamic query, and it'll now allow me to select the value from this list of fields that the database is pulling. In this case, I want name. And this is going to put in what we call a token. In this case, it is the variable called name from the database set result. And you can see now that if I were to provide name equals Matt, it's going to pre-populate that field for me. Let's shrink this up a little bit here so we can populate age so you can see what that looks like. So let's go in and let's go to age. And for its default value, we'll select the age column. We'll run our form. By default, nothing is in here, but if we close this one and run the form that already has name equals something, now you're going to notice that we're populating the age as well. Sorry for clicking that link right there. But you can see here that we're now populating this field. But if we go back to our content, you can see that I have a name of Steve Smith, for example. So if I say instead of name equals Matt, but Steve Smith, if I run this form, it's going to grab the other record, in this case just one, and it's still going to populate my form fields right here. So now let's take this another step further, which is to say, well, how do I then update a record in the database? So I'm using a query item to populate two fields. Now let's go in and update our database with new values for those fields. So to do that, I'm going to add a SQL Plus item to my form. And the SQL Plus is going to be, instead of an insert, it's going to be an update. So I'm going to say update FB demo set name equals some value, comma age equals some value, where ID equals some value. So you notice wherever I have a question mark, I'm basically saying some value. Now, as we already saw, in order to populate those values, I need to define my variables. So in this case, I'm looking for a form field called name and age. And sure enough, I have a form field called name, and I have a form field called age. By the way, you can use the dynamic variable picker to just say, grab the age field. So two fields, name and age. Now there's a problem though, which is that when you update a database, you always need to have a where clause that specifies which row you want to update. Now it is totally possible that you want to take every row in this database and update the name to the same thing, but almost certainly not. Not to say it can never happen, but generally speaking, if you want to update a database, you want to grab a specific item. So if I wanted to grab item 302 right here, I could say where ID equals some value. Well, how about I'll just put in 302. So I'll just hard code this. Now when I run the form and we put in, I shrank mine down, so we'll say name equals Matt. So I'm going to change this to 46. But now, yeah, make this a little bit smaller so we can kind of keep this guy open for a while. Now what's going to happen is it's going to run this query and it's going to update the record where the ID equals 302, right? ID equals 302. So age is 43. If I refresh, it should be 46. And it's actually not. So what's happening here is, oops, I actually spelled that table name wrong. I had the capital D. Let's try that again real quick. It's going to say that should have worked. Sometimes things will get a little bit funny if you try to use text values in here. But yeah, it's actually still not updating it. Set name. So I think what's happening here is it doesn't like the hard-coded value right here. So here's what we're going to do. We're actually going to put, instead of sort of hard-coding a value right here, we are going to put a dynamic value. So I'm going to add a field, and I'm going to call this field ID, and I'm going to set its default value to ID. And now I can say where ID equals the form field called ID. So now I have name, age, and ID, and if I run this, let's kind of back up here, I should be able to change this to 46. Notice the ID is 302 up here. And now it should be updating this in my database correctly. So there it is. So really the lesson here is, and I even have to remind myself of this sometimes, is this sort of variable list right here. Well, you can put raw variables in some context. Generally speaking, variables are meant to be dynamic. So the only thing that it really wants in here are variables that have a dynamic value, which in this case would be like a form field. What's critical about this is variables can be lots of different things. So they can be form fields, as we have right here, so the capital F, but in the case of the select query right here, there are get variables. So we have the G, and you'll notice if I mouse over here, it gives me a little shortcut of what some of these are right here. So form field, session, post, get, and PHP. So now we can put this, of course, all together in sort of a more dynamic application. So I have a database item that's selecting based on some variable that I give it, in this case a name. I'm then collecting values, I press submit, and it goes to an update statement on my database right here, which then is putting in form field name, age, and ID. So that's what's happening behind the scenes. And let's actually create a little body text right here. And just kind of show these. So here is a select statement. That's one way of doing this. We also have an insert or an update statement right here. So we have an update statement. So there's two different ways of doing that. But of course, the idea in RackForms is that you shouldn't always have to do this by hand. So let's just go ahead and delete these two guys and delete all of our fields right here. And let's just talk about a slightly different way of doing this. So if I have a form like this, where I know I have a given table that has a record that I want to pull, I can use an automated tool to build all the stuff that we just built by hand. And we do that by right-clicking and selecting the SQL automator, giving a table name, in this case FB demo, and then saying populate all pages. And what this is going to do is it's going to create, as noted before, those items that I created by hand before. So here is a select item, so it's grabbing from FB demo, and then here is the update item, where I'm updating FB demo and I'm setting the name and age where the ID is equal to something. You'll notice it also went through and it added the pre-population for these fields right here, and it actually added these two code blocks right here, which you don't need to know how they work, but essentially what they're doing is they're allowing us to grab an ID same as we had before. So in other words, when I open this form, let's actually grab this version right here because it's already open. What it's basically doing is saying if I provide a proper value, so 302, it's going to pull that value. I can then change it to whatever I want here. I can submit it. And then in my database, my value has been updated right here. So that is sort of like a nice, easy way of automating all the work that we did before. But to be clear, behind the scenes, all we're doing is writing SQL, pre-populating fields, and then making sure that on the update, we're once again running the proper SQL that pulls from the proper fields. So we'll leave it at this for now. Questions, comments, as always they say, please let us know in the comments down below. There are more versions of this logic, as we always like to say. There are other ways of handling updatable pages. The one I'm going to show real quick, just in closing, just in case this is all a bit too too much in terms of features of what you need. You just want something quick and dirty. We absolutely support that as well. And we do that through a builder page. So a builder page allows us to take a SQL statement. We can use a visual builder to do it, in fact. I can just say grab the ID, name, and age columns, same as we did before. I can tell it to build an update/delete template for us. And now when I run this form, it's giving me all those records that I had before. And then I can select records for deletion. I can update records, so I can change this age back to 46, update them, etc. And so all of this can be done very simply in RackForms. The reason why we have that first method is that the builder page method is really good at showing lots of results at once, but it doesn't always fit well if you have really big forms or if you need forms where you still need to validate fields. And that's where this method comes in. This sort of using the populate all fields with the select statement and an update statement is specifically used for those times where, let's say you have a workflow where you have folks coming in, they're filling in parts of a form, maybe they're coming back a day later, you then build a system, allow them to grab the appropriate record and then to use the form pretty much the first time they use it to update and add any records that they maybe didn't get the first time they visited the form. So thank you so much for watching.